Now, the US President Donald Trump is shaking up global trade again with his latest tariffs on steel and aluminium coming into effect. The 25% tax applies to all imports of the metals into the US. The European Union says it is retaliating with tariffs on 26 billion euros worth of US goods. Trump's tariffs are another blow to Europe's already struggling steel industry.
Sparks fly non-stop at this steel production site near Amsterdam. But staff here say that business as usual is becoming something of a battle, with US tariff policy the latest in a long line of woes.
We basically have costs related to the whole decarbonisation journey. And at the same time, we face massive overcapacity across the world. And basically, so it's a sort of a perfect storm.
This high-grade steel is used for batteries, packaging and car parts. It's hard to produce elsewhere, meaning some US customers will keep coming. But the bigger fear is that more subsidised Asian metals end up in the European Union, as China looks for alternative markets amid flaring tensions with the US.
That steel will be redirected, and with Europe being one of the only remaining open markets in the world, Europe is a likely target. If you have a lack of a level playing field, instead of innovation, you start cutting costs. You start basically, to get into survival mode.
Energy prices in Europe also run much hotter than elsewhere.
In this room, liquid steel is cast into slabs. The slabs come out at about 800 degrees Celsius or 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. And even from afar, you can really feel the heat on your face here.
This Dutch plant says it's still optimistic. But in recent years, steel factory closures and job cuts have been announced across the EU.
We've seen something like 30 million tonnes lost in terms of steel production in the last year or so. And when we turn 30 million tonnes into steel workers' jobs, we're talking about the loss of thousands of jobs across Europe.
Brussels says it stands ready to back up this strategic sector. Last month, the EU unveiled steps to try and cut energy costs and stimulate demand for cleaner steel, with more action planned for late March.
There is really a mix of measures necessary, making private investment less risky, but I think in general creating this what we call them lead markets, so that the industry actors are really incentivized to invest in the decarbonization so they can kind of reap the green premium.
Though the EU insists this is in line with green promises, climate campaigners fear the bloc is backtracking on pledges to make polluters pay.
The industry always says we're losing jobs because we can't compete with other countries with lower standards. And we would really not be happy with the EU participating in this race to the bottom rhetoric.
Back at the Dutch steel plant, efforts to decarbonise are underway. But staff here say future-proofing an industry facing crisis now is no mean feat.
I'm joined now by Trinh Nguyen from Hong Kong. She's a senior economist with the investment company Natixis. Welcome to DW. As we just heard in that report, European steel producers are worrying now that even more Asian metals could end up in the European market because of Trump's tariffs on steel and aluminium. How likely is this?
Well, very likely. First of all, this is not a new tariff. It's just a removal of exemptions, right? Because this is a 25% tariff already in place in 2025. Europe got the exemptions as well as other allies like Japan and South Korea and Australia and Canada and Mexico. So by removing this exemptions, it levels the playing field. And the playing field is not actually level, as the report suggested. Input costs are very different in different regions. China obviously produces a much cheaper scale. So by raising tariffs for everyone on steel, it erodes this competitiveness that Canada, Mexico, EU, South Korea, and Japan have. And in response to this, the Asians, the South Korean and the Vietnamese have raised duties on Chinese steel because in response to higher barriers to U.S. trade, China has exported more to the rest of the world, right? To Southeast Asia, to North Asia, to Europe, and elsewhere, Latin America. But it's facing that friction within Asia. So that means that what will the Europeans do on top of easing input costs for the Europeans and lowering the regulatory hurdles? I think it's very likely they might want to consider what the Koreans and the Vietnamese doing, which is putting on anti-dumping duties for Chinese steel. So it's not just Chinese steel. We could potentially see other Asian steels trying to move to Europe as well. But I think that is a big concern. And what that means is that there is going to be more tariff barriers globally in response to this, because the U.S. is the biggest importer of global goods. And when it has more barriers on the import of it, and everyone else produces more than they consume, then we have a problem here. Either we reduce capacity or we have to erect barriers, right?
This obviously is having huge ripple effects. Who is going to feel the pain more? Is it the U.S. economy or is it the rest of the world?
Well, for the steel importers, I think, first of all, I think for Canada and Mexico, it's a relative game, right? While this sector is not very large, there are other sectors that import steel. So it helps the U.S. steel makers, but there are more consumer of steel goods than the steel makers themselves. So I think you have to think about a short-term and longer term. So there's a bit of a short-term pain here for American sectors, very, very sensitive to steel. Transportation is one, and so on and so forth. So as a result, it has a net effect of negative for the U.S. in the short term, in my opinion, because when prices rise, the production is not rising fast enough, and therefore you have a bit of a volume decline, right? And so I think it has a negative impact. But for those that depend on this much more proportionally, they will feel the pain, of course. And I think for China's steel makers, for example, they already have excess capacity onshore, and they're trying to export it wherever they can. The biggest export markets, Vietnam, Korea, and so on and so forth, have already increased hurdles. For those sector, they will probably have to reduce capacity, for example.
OK, we've seen stock markets seeing steep losses. Economists are warning of a potential recession in the US. What do you make of President Trump's promise that the American economy will ultimately benefit from all of this?
I think steel is a good example of that, right? So far, if you look at what President Trump has done, it's basically 20% tariffs on China and the removal exemptions of steel. Now, the China question is that since we've already used to this since 2018, 2017, we can substitute some of these products, and people have reshuffled their supply chains to the US, to Europe, to Southeast Asia, and so on. So if we, on the steel issue, is a good example of what is about to come. If he imposes tariffs on everyone, it supports U.S. steel makers, but they're not able to ramp up the capacity so quickly, right, as the pace in which the president imposes tariffs. And we're just looking at steel now. It could be auto, it could be chips, it could be pharmaceutical. So over the long run, those sectors will benefit in the U.S. because they benefit from protectionism, right, by default of higher tariffs relative to abroad. But in the short term, you have a shock, right? A shock to the system. And this is just steel for now and removal exemptions. We have other impending ones, and it remains to be seen. My thesis is that if the shocks are seen as too abrupt, again, the U.S. imports 4.1 trillion of good, and that has an impact, not just direct import, but so into other sectors, even services and housing, right? So when you have that, and of course, consumer confidence and investment, so when you have that impacting prices, but the volume not rising enough, what happens is that consumption and investment falls. When consumption and investment falls, we have a fall of GDP in the short term, right? Over the longer horizon, production will rise, but in the short term, there is a big shock. Now, the shock can be mitigated if the tariffs are targeted, right? And when their tariffs are targeted and consistent, then producers and exporters and importers know exactly what to come, and they act accordingly. And moreover, there is a way to substitute from that in the short term.
All right. Economist Trinh Nguyen in Hong Kong, thank you so much for your analysis.